Chapter 28. Each foot seemed to weigh a ton. As Theo walked down the center aisle, an aisle that led directly to the podium, and a few feet behind with at the hard faces of the commissioners, he realized he had nothing to say. Nothing was prepared, not a single note. He was terrified, numb, have trouble breathing, and suddenly thinking of running away, of vanishing. A familiar face appeared to his left near the aisle. It was the major, smiling proudly with a fist clenched, as if to say, "Go get him, Theo." Theo was aware that he was being followed. He could feel bodies hustling behind him, and he could see the other kids moving in from his right and left. By the time he arrived at the podium, they were swarming around it. Dozens of kids, maybe hundreds, all in their yellow battle gear. Small kids from kindergarten to Jackson Elementary, and older students from Theo's and Hardy's band of activists. They bunched together in one yellow mob around the podium and looked at the commissioners. Reluctantly, Theo stepped up to the podium. He took the microphone, pulled it down a few inches, and tried to think of something to say. The room was still and quiet. The rowdy mob of adults was silenced by the courage of the kids. Theo tried desperately to remember all the rules and tips from his debating career, but all at that horrible moment, his memory failed him. He was as stiff as a board and had never been so frightened. After a few awkward seconds, it was obvious that no one was going to speak for him. So he cleared his throat, pulled down his yellow mask, and managed to say, "I'm Theo Boone, and I'm in 8th grade at Strattonburg Middle School." Mr. Cerrone came to his aid with a quick, are you the kid who made the video on YouTube?" "Yes, sir, with some friends." This brought a roar from the crowd that stunned Theo. He glanced over his shoulder and saw people standing and yelling, and he managed to smile. At last count, the video had over 100,000 hits, and Theo guessed that everyone in the auditorium had seen it, probably more than once. When the moment passed and the crowd settled down, Mr. Cerrone said, "Well, thanks, Mr. Boone, for that video." None of the other commissioners seemed to share his gratitude, but Mr. Sam McGray suddenly asked, "Are you the kid with the dog?" "Yes, sir. If I recall correctly, according to the newspaper, you referred to the people who want to build a bypass as a bunch of thugs or something like that." A few slight hisses from the crowd, good people behind Theo who didn't like the question. He realized he had the advantage of being a kid. The commissioners could not afford to be rude or rough with him. After all, he was only 13 years old. Theo replied coolly, "No, sir, the thugs I was referring to were the thugs who beat my dog." Mr. McGray nodded but said nothing else. "How is your dog?" Mr. Cerrone asked. "He's doing fine, thank you." There was a smattering of hands clapping. "Can we move along?" Mr. Grimes said with a great irritation. He was already tired of looking at all those brats out there, faces behind yellow masks and bandanas. Mr. Stack, as chairman, said, "You have the floor, Mr. Boone. No longer than 5 minutes." He glared at Theo, drilling him with his black eyes. Theo could not maintain eye contact. Theo could not breathe or think or do anything but stand, clutching the sides of the podium as the seconds ticked by and everyone waited. He felt like he felt like fainting. One of Mr. Mount's more difficult sessions during debate had been an exercise of spontaneous speaking, or rising before a crowd with no notes, no preparation. Each side entered the debate cold, with no idea of what to expect, no idea of what the issue would be. Mr. Mount then announced the topic of the day, and each side was given 5 minutes to scramble, prepare, and try to form intelligent arguments. The first trick, according to Mr. Mount, was to relate to the topic to something personal, something you know a lot about. Theo looked at Mr. Cerrone, an ally, and began, "Both my parents are lawyers, and I'm lucky enough to spend hours in their office. I've sort of grown up in there, and I've learned a lot, at least for a 13-year-old. I've done plenty of research into the legal rule of eminent domain, or the government's right to take property away from a person who doesn't want to sell. In our country, owning property is a very important right, something most Americans dream of, and for most Americans, the dream comes true. He was breathing well. His voice was settling to a nice rhythm. He was still terrified, but he was managing to hide his fear. He remembered Mr. Mount's constant advice: speak slowly, speak clearly, speak deeply. The crowd was silent. Go, Theo. Eminent domain is to be used only in extreme cases, and this is not one of them. This bypass is not crucial to our lives here in Strattenburg. In fact, life will go on here just the same without the bypass. It might benefit a few, but the vast majority of us will never know the difference. So, under our laws, this project is not crucial. Therefore, the government cannot take property using eminent domain. And why should the government? A slight pause for dramatic effect. He just remembered a great line, something he had read in a Supreme Court case. Just because the government is big enough, strong enough, rich enough, and powerful enough doesn't mean it has the right to take land from its citizens. This landed perfectly, and the crowd reacted with another boisterous round of approval. Theo had found his rhythm, his traction, and for a brief moment he relished being in the spotlight. He shifted his weight like all good lawyers do in court when addressing the jury, and he wished he could pace back and forth, but he was stuck behind the mic. He continued looking at Mr. Cerrone's friendly face and said, "You've already heard from Reverend Quinn, who described their family's farm. Well, I've been there. Hardy Quinn is my friend and one of the kids behind the video. He's grown up on the family farm, a beautiful 100-acre piece of land that every one of us would love to live on. It has everything: thick forests for hunting, springs and creeks for fishing, the river for rafting, open pastures for growing hay, miles and miles of trails for hiking and horseback riding. There's a tree house, a barn, a stable, a tool shed, cemetery, and an old country house where the Quinn family gathers every holiday and on most weekends. On the front porch, hundreds of Quinns have gathered over the years to drink iced tea and talk about life. In the backyard, they've had weddings, funerals, and a pig roast every 4th of July. Just imagine the state highway department reducing it all to rubble with a bunch of bulldozers. That would be wrong. Several of the crowd agreed and voiced their approval. All 5 commissioners were staring at Theo, hanging on every word. He threw another punch with, "That would be an abuse of power." He changed gears, raised his voice, and said, "Now, the smart folks who designed this bypass think it's a good idea to reroute 25,000 vehicles a day along an elementary school within a soccer complex. At least 10,000 of these will be large trucks with diesel engines. Since no one has bothered to conduct an accurate study of how much the air will be polluted, we don't, excuse me, you don't know what you're talking about. No one does. It seems to me, though, and I'm a kid lawyer and not a kid scientist, that the last place you would want to build a busy 4-lane road is right next to a school." Hardy, Woody, Chase, and April were standing behind Theo, and on cue they began coughing and gagging. The rest caught on quickly, and for about 30 seconds the entire yellow horde shook and gyrated, and bent double in an exaggerated display of the effects of diesel contamination. Mr. Stagg finally raised his hand and said patiently, "Okay, okay." The coughing and gagging stopped immediately. The crowd was greatly amused, as were most of the commissioners and their assistants. Theo continued, "Fortunately, my school is not close to the proposed bypass, but let me tell you a little about my school. In the past 2 months, my school has been forced to cut programs, lay off part time workers, fire coaches, janitors, and cafeteria workers, and cancel trips. Every school in our district has done this. Why? Budget cuts, not enough revenue. And it's not just the schools. Our police and fire departments have laid off employees. We've had cuts in street maintenance, garbage collection, parks and recreation, in every single department. You know that because you've been forced to cut the county's budget." Another pause as he looked up for the kill. "How can you, as leaders of our community, cut budgets one day, then vote to approve a bypass to nowhere that will cost $200 million?" The crowd roared instantly, and within seconds, many of those cheering were on their feet. The ovation went on and gathered steam, and Theo took a step backward. Mr. Stack raised his hand for order, but he was ignored. What was he going to do anyway? Arrest several hundred people at one time? Wisely, he sat grim faced and listened to the roar. During one brief second, he locked eyes with Theo, and both knew the truth. Theo realized his little off the cuff speech had reached its peak. Mr. Mount always said that it's best to quit when you're ahead. Many speakers lose their audience by going on too long. Plus, Theo was so relieved to have made it this far, and he really had nothing left. When the crowd finally settled down, he stepped back to the microphone and said, "Thank you." "Thank you, Mr. Boone," Mr. Stack said. It was almost midnight. The last speaker had just spoken. There was nothing left on the agenda but a vote on the bypass. It was obvious the crowd was not leaving until the commissioners voted. The kids in yellow did not return to their seats. Instead, they bunched even closer together around the podium and up the aisles as close to the commissioners as they could get. They locked arms and sat on the floor. "You guys can go back to your seats," Mr. Stack said. But the kids shook their heads. They weren't budging. From the back, a loudmouth stood up and yelled, "We want to vote." This immediately led to another deafening round of "We want to vote. We want to vote." The walls shook and the windows rattled, and the commissioners looked aggravated and confused. They wanted to huddle in the back room, as was their usual custom, and work out a deal before going public. But not tonight, not at this moment. There was nothing to do but vote. Mr. Stack raised his hand again and finally brought the crowd under control. He said, "Very well. Under the rules of this commission, it is now necessary that we take a vote. Madam Secretary, will you call the roll?" At the end of the long table, the secretary said, "Certainly. All 5 commissioners are present and voting. The vote will be simple: yes to approve the bypass and no if you do not approve the project. Approval is by a simple majority. Mr. Stack, yes. Mr. Grimes, yes. Mr. Cerrone, no. Mr. McGray." Mr. McGray was rubbing his white whiskers, troubled and deep in thought. With a scratchy voice, he finally said, "No." Theo was sitting on the floor in front of the podium, arm in arm with Hardy and April, and it seemed as though every kid around it was holding his or her breath. At that tense moment, things did not look good. The vote was tied 2-2, with only Mr. Klasko remaining, and he had given a clear impression he wanted to bypass. Mr. Klasko Mr. Klasko's spine stiffened and his head jerked back. He ran a hand over his mouth, fidgeted, and seemed to be short of breath, and finally managed to blurt, "Abstain." Mitchell Stack and Lucas Grimes shot panicked looks at Buddy Klasko, who wasn't looking at anyone. He was gazing at a distant window, obviously wanting to jump through it. The crowd gasped and mumbled, and no one seemed certain of the vote. The secretary calmly announced, by a vote of 2 in favor, 2 opposed, and 1 abstention, the motion to approve the Red Creek Bypass project hereby fails for lack of a majority. This set off a rowdy standing ovation. The kids in the front of the room were jumping and applauding. Their parents were hugging and high-fiving and shaking hands and celebrating. In the midst of the noise, the 5 commissioners gathered their papers and began to leave. The experts from the State Highway Department and the project supporters grabbed their briefcases and materials and headed for the nearest door. The meeting was adjourned, but the kids were not leaving. Instead, they swarmed around the podium where Theo Boone stood at the center of the mob, soaking up his finest moment. That's the end of chapter 28.